Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third Impact International Safety Call. I want to thank you all for being here with us this morning. We're really excited for our guest speakers. This morning we actually have three. General President Eric Dean is going to join us as we get started. It's just kind of an intro, and he has a few things he'd like to share with everyone. If you happen to miss the first two calls, I want to make it aware that they are available for viewing on the Impact website. There's a link you can click on that will take you to YouTube, or you can watch the first two. A lot of great information was shared in those calls, and I would encourage, if you didn't get to see them, take some time, go back and view them. A lot of great stuff was shared. And before that, I'd like to just bring everybody up to speed on a few things that's going on in the impact in the ironworker safety world. The New England District Council is holding an Impact Safety Summit Roundtable October 22nd in Boston, Mass. There's more information on that and the agenda on the Impact website. If you're in that Boston, Mass area or the New England District Council area, I know they just did one in California. I've heard great things about this. A lot of information will be shared. So I'd encourage you to go to the website, check that out. Again, that's October 22nd. See if you can fit it in and get there and participate. There's an Impact Safety and Health Roundtable being held in conjunction with the Talk Winter Meetings. That's held in Washington, D.C. on December 10th. I've personally attended that several times. Again, a great time of information, safety, sharing going on, what's going on nationally, kind of sets the agenda for the year to come. I know that Mr. Rank puts a lot of time and effort into that. So if you're going to be in the DC area or be at the talk meetings, I would recommend spending some time and coming to that. A lot of good stuff goes on there. And then finally, just again, a reminder about the 2020 Impact Conference. It's been given a name now. It's called the Impact of Tech. We all know that construction, we kind of lag in the tech world. We kind of stay in the old bullpen beater welding hood days, but there's a lot of things going on technologically wise that can really help improve safety, production, all those kind of things. So that's a big focus of it. It is going to be in Chicago this year, April 14th through the 17th. Again, great time. I'd advise everybody to be there. A new format this year. We're trying to freshen it up, keep it lively, and information for that is also on the website. So with that, we have three guest speakers, like I said today. The first one I want to introduce is General President of the Ironworkers, Eric Dean. And Eric has agreed or asked to be a part of the call this morning. He wants to share a few words with us, and we're thrilled to have him here with us. Most of you know Eric. Those who don't, like I said, he is General President of the Ironworkers. So I'm not going to go into a deep bio on him, but Eric, thank you for your time and joining us here this morning. Go ahead and share a few words with us, if you would, please.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. I'd like to thank everyone for joining today and taking time out of your busy schedules. Through technology, we've been enabled to get together a little more easy than having to fly somewhere, or but nothing is more important than safety to collaborate. At last look, it looks like we have nearly 300 people registered to participate today, and I know there's people jungling up on multiple lines, and so I know how important safety is. The ironworkers, through our apprenticeship programs, stress how to do our jobs as safely as possible, how to prepare the union ironworker to deliver his skills in the safest and most efficient manner. So that is something that we've been working on. It's tried and it's true. But what we're starting to see is the regulatory environment that puts more and more onus on supervisors as it relates to safety. And we know that the companies get to select their supervisory personnel. It's incumbent upon us as union leaders to make sure as many of our members participate in these safety supervisor courses that Impact is providing to equip our members and your employees, I should say, to be the most equipped in the supervisory role. We do many things. We collaborate with regulatory agencies, As an example, you have someone from OSHA, Kim is on from OSHA today. And those are the open dialogue we have to make sure that we're as compliant with regulatory issues in the ironworking industry as possible. Now, Pete talked about two safety impact events that happened both in California and upcoming in Boston. I would encourage you that if you've gone to your impact regional advisory boards locally and you've run out of new and fresh topics, this is a perfect way to take off and continue the safety dialogue. And then in addition, Steve's going to talk about our certification program that allows rank and file ironworkers to obtain additional safety subject matter expertise, along with you, the company, sending hand-picked people that you want to rise up and elevate in that leadership. So we've had 7 fatalities this year. I will not rest until we send everyone home every day uninjured. And I ask each contractor and each union leader to do the same. I thank Pete. I thank Steve. I thank the Impact Board of Trustees for allowing this quarterly call. And I was on the first one, happy to be on the third one. I am meeting with the Department of Energy out west here at the Metal Trades Conference, so I will not be here for the entire call. But I thank each and every one of you on your daily task of keeping our members safe. And thank you.
All right, Eric, thank you for that. Thank you for your time. I'll back up everything Eric said. I know that's it's number one with the International, with Impact, as we're at the Board of Directors meetings and the things we do. It's not just words. I see them backing it up with time, money, effort, all those things. So appreciate that and appreciate you being here with us this morning. And thank you for that, for your time.
Have a good day.
Okay, so with that, we'll get on to our next two guests and the topic of the day. Our topic, which I think is a great one. It's something that that we need to understand and learn more about. It's understanding supervisor roles and responsibilities and how OSHA and the NLRB establish grounds for violations. With us today, we're very excited about this. We have Kimberly Steely from the OSHA. She is a regional administrator for the Kansas City region. Kimberly joined OSHA in 1987. Her bio is long and extensive, but I can tell you she's held many, many positions within OSHA. She's also served the agency as a director and the acting deputy director for enforcement programs in the OSHA National Office. And as I said, today she is regional administrator for the Kansas City region. Kim, thank you so much for joining us for today's topic. We also have with us, many of you are familiar with Mr. Steve Rank. Steve is the Executive Director of Safety and Health for the Ironworkers International. Same thing, his bio is extensive and long. He's deeply involved in all the safety issues that are going on with the ironworkers today. His primary responsibilities address safety, health, and insurance issues that affect ironworkers throughout the U.S. and Canada. So Steve, thank you for being with us. Kim, again, thank you for being with us. Looking forward to this, and I would encourage everyone, as you have questions, please ask them. They're on the bottom. There's a Q&A tab. You can ask you that. There's also a chat tab. I would encourage people to use the Q&A tab if you can. Ask those questions, and as we go along, we will do our best to get them answered. So, Steve and Kim, the floor is yours.
Great. If I could ask Kim to click her button so we could see her, that would be great.
No, I think we can. We see her.
I did.
Yep,
Okay.
she's on.
Great. I'll pull this up here. Great. Well, I'm really pleased that Kim Steely is able to join us today. Just a little more background on Kim. Kim is probably one of the longest standing career people with the agency today, and she brings with her many years of experience. She was there whenever we developed a new subpart R steel erection standard, and she's been there through a lot of changes in the industry. So I've developed a working relationship with Kim. We're involved in a partnership to develop this same format in a video, a webinar with all the Department of Labor people and employers around the United States, and that'll probably happen later this fall or early next year. So I'm really pleased that Kim was able to join us today. And I'm sure that you're going to find a lot of her information very helpful in understanding this topic of the roles and responsibilities of supervisors in the workplace. It's a two-pronged approach. One is the regulatory part of it that Kim is going to drill down on, that we all have to be aware of. The second is these roles and responsibilities from a contract perspective. More and more, we're seeing employers, project owners, and general contractors put in their contract documents that we have to have documentation on trained supervisors in the workplace. So as President Dean said earlier, this is a growing demand from project owners and general contractors to supply this kind of qualified supervision on projects throughout North America. This issue, as President Dean mentioned, is just part of President Dean's Zero Injury campaign. And he commissioned this when he took over as general president as a continuation that achieve our first year with 0 fatalities and hopefully 0 injuries. But we're going to keep pressing in, and we've put a lot of efforts and resources on this issue of drilling down to these first line supervisors or foremen, okay? He also mentioned a certification course. We're pleased to be working with the International Accreditation Services to develop the very first trade certification for safety and supervisors. This will be industry specific. It'll talk about ironworker issues. It'll talk about regulatory issues. And I assure you, it's going to talk, as part of this, there'll be a special segment in this, a chapter on just what we're covering today. Because don't we want our supervisors to understand their roles and responsibilities and all these different situations that they're running into that we're going to talk about today, whether it's an intermittent supervisor situation, or if you have direct supervision or inherent. So these are different things that we have to impart to our contractors and our employers. So with that, I am going to, and I hope everybody can see Kim here.
Yeah, they see her. You need to go into presentation mode on your slide.
Yes.
Yep, there you go. Perfect.
It's not pulling up there. I'm sorry. It's not going to.
Click on the resume slideshow right on top of the slide. There you go.
Oh, there we go. Thank you, Tim. Okay.
Before we get started, I want to thank Steve. I want to thank all of you for the invitation to present to so many people. It's quite an honor to be able to talk to, and I know it's through the advent of technologies, to talk to so many people all at one time. It is a very valuable lesson or information, as Steve alluded to, and as Mr. Dean alluded to. It's a sad day, a sad time when we have to talk about fatalities, and I understand that you've had 7 fatalities across the nation this year, which is very, very distressing. And I'm very appreciative of the fact that the iron workers, as well as OSHA, are working towards 0 injuries. I'm hoping at some point in time before I retire that we do achieve that collectively. But I want to impress upon you the importance of the supervisor on the construction site and the overall safety of the employees that are there, that are working under their direction. Traditionally, supervisors, people have the opinion that supervisors have to have the ability to hire, fire, suspend, whatever, to impact actions that may impact their wages or their working conditions. And as you'll learn in the presentation, that's not necessarily the case based on some court decisions under the National Labor Relations Board or through the Act. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started, Steve.
Great. Well, thank you, Kim, again. So just as an overview of this topic is why we are addressing this topic. Well, from a regulatory standpoint, you're going to see real quick that we have to know the rules of engagement. whether you're an employer or if you're a first-line supervisor. And Kim has really helped us tee this up. She's reached out to the National Labor Relations Board to get court cases that supports and defines these roles and responsibilities. And then, as I mentioned, from a project contract perspective, we're required to provide these kind of qualified supervisors in the workplace anyway. But there's nothing worse than having a big incident. And that's what prompted this whole thing with Kim, was a serious incident resulting in a fatality where all these things came to the forefront. The employer didn't understand their roles and responsibilities of designated, qualified, and competent supervisors. The employer failed to work with them. On the other hand, our supervision, our foreman in the field, failed to carry out the employer's safety policies and procedures. And at the end of the day, the agency came in and it all came out, it all surfaced to the top, unfortunately. So it was a hard lesson learned, but this continues to happen throughout the country on a routine basis where these same issues keep coming up. So with that, that is the overview of what we're going to accomplish today. So why are supervisors so important to job site safety, and why are project owners requiring third-party certifications? Well, we all know that supervisors can take immediate direct action. If somebody is doing something, whether it's an unsafe act or unsafe condition, or maybe they're just not productive enough, that supervisor will step in, okay? Number two, supervisors can exercise control. Believe me, our foreman will direct their iron workers underneath their control to do whatever needs to be done on that job site. Number three, supervisors have responsibility and accountability, and we're going to learn a lot about that today. So here are some of the key objectives of the call today. We're going to review key definitions. That this could be the very first time that many of you have ever heard these definitions, but they've been around a long time with the agency. Number two, provide examples of employer responsibilities. Provide examples of supervisor responsibilities. Discuss the National Labor Relations Board case history that defines, quote, supervisors. And to review common supervisor situations on a job site. And then, of course, we're going to take questions throughout this webinar. So feel free to type those in the bottom, as Pete mentioned, and we'll be glad to take any questions as we go through this.
Hey, Steve, this is Pete. I have a question right off the bat. Could you explain a little bit more about the National Labor Relations Board, what their role is, what they do, kind of how they fit in with this and fit in with OSHA?
I'll
let Kim Steely address that. Kim, go ahead and explain that.
The National Labor Relations Board is an independent agency. It's not part of the Department of Labor, that functions separately and defining what the role of management to employee bargaining units is. There's a National Labor Relations Act that defines what some of those rules are. But more importantly, as in this case, there have been several court challenges, typically from some of them from OSHA, but some from other outside entities that have further defined what that relationship between management and BUE or management and employee relations are, where supervisors come into play, what are working conditions, workplace safety. It's an independent board, and it's we operate in conjunction with one another. OSHA has operated under the decisions of the National Labor Relations Board since the beginning of time. Unfortunately, as Steve mentioned, not everybody is versed or everybody is willing to seek out why certain actions are taking place. It's always kind of scratch your head and let's start from the very beginning. So this presentation is very, very important from that perspective. So each of you don't have to go out and research what those court decisions are, what your obligations are, what's a supervisor, what's an employee, and when you step over that line. I hope I answered your question.
Well put, Kim. That's why I defer this question to you. So, very good answer. Very, very clear.
Okay.
So, Kim, why don't you take a little further here, and just to keep this in the back of your mind, the first thing that's going to happen when the agency representative, the compliance officer, comes to your job site, either in response to a serious incident or complaint, here's what's going to happen. Take it away, Kim.
I thank you. I'm assuming most of you or most of the attendees are fully aware of how OSHA operates, how we get to your job sites, what authority we have once we reach your job sites. It's also mandated by a congressional act. The OSHA Act defines what we can or cannot do with respect to job site inspections. We come in unsolicited, we come in unannounced. Our compliance officers generally, there's only a very small exception, do we ever inform the employer up front that we're coming on site. I will tell you right off the bat for construction activities, though this policy, these NLRB rules are applicable to every industry, not just construction alone. But in particular with construction, a significant number of our resources are directed towards the construction industry because you've all been told time and time again that the preponderance of fatalities and serious injuries and illnesses take place in the construction industry. And our goal is your goal. That is to minimize or eliminate workplace fatalities, injuries, and illnesses. So we do exert a lot of our authority in the construction industry. I would say anywhere from 50 to 60% of our resources are directed there. So when OSHA shows up at your door, the employer has many, many, many options as to what they can or cannot do, all right? But when OSHA shows up, the compliance officer will ask for the highest ranking official, the operator, the manager, the foreman, the supervisor, and in times on construction site, it is generally a general contractor or a supervisor on site because you have multiple jobs going on at the time. We ask for that individual because we have to request access to the job site, right? And the employer always has the option to request a warrant and say, I don't want you here, come back at another time. Fortunately, that doesn't happen as often as one might think, because the goal of both entities, yourselves and us, is to remove employees from risk. So when we get to the job site, we will ask for the manager, the supervisor, the operator to get access to the job site, right? And if the general contractor, the manager is not on site, the attitude is that there has to be a supervisor. Someone is in charge, all right? Someone is dictating or mandating or providing instructions as to what to do, who should do it, when to do it, how to do it. So that's where the supervisor comes into play. Who is the supervisor, right? In instances, sadly to say, we have been at some construction sites where no one steps up to the plate. There isn't a single employee for the subcontractor, the general contractor who's willing to step forward and say, I'm the supervisor. But that doesn't negate the opportunity for the agency to go in and do an on-site inspection and remove employees from serious injuries and illnesses that could take place immediately. We simply document what efforts we undertook, who we talked to, names, titles, phone numbers, contact information, who they work for, to try and determine after the fact, because the inspection will take place, who indeed was the supervisor. So I highly recommend the supervisor is a very, very important role on the job site because, as Steve put it previously, they do have direct and immediate control over that job site and the ability to remove employees from risk. So again, we will ask for the supervisor, the general foreman, or the manager once we get onto your job site to request access, right?
Very well put. Again, that's a good description of what happens when they show up. So I'm hoping all the employers see the gravity of this, and they have to be prepared. And everything that we're going to go through here shortly is something all of our employers need to know, as well as the foremen that are working at their direction. Agreed, Kim?
Correct. Understanding that when the supervisor is designated or someone steps out, they are assuming responsibility for the safety and health of those employees. And that's what Steve's going to get into next.
Yeah. So let's talk about the term supervisor. And we're going to get into this in more detail, but any individual having authority in the interest of the employer, and you will see these words, authority in the interest of the employer, in a lot of the cases that Kim is going to reference and take excerpts from. So, and the bottom line is the supervisor is one who has authority to perform certain duties. So, Kim, why don't you go over what the basic fundamental traditional test is for determining supervisory status?
Absolutely. And to clarify some of you may not be aware, but you may have, and I see in your union contracts, you may have actual authority where you're designated, but there's also a parent authority or indirect authority. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But the NLRB, under Section 211 of their act, it clearly defines what are the traditional tests to determine whether or not you have supervisory status, right? Whether you exercise the authority, in addition to those, do you have the authority to use independent judgment, or are you merely parroting what someone from a higher office would tell you what to do, whether it's the CEO or a manager who is, safety and health manager who is not on site. Whether you as the job site supervisor hold the authority in the interest of the employer. Has the employer designated? Have they inferred? Have they condoned your activities as an employer? And whether or not you have the ability to engage in any of the following 12 criteria. These are the traditional and stereotypical actions that an individual may take, which represents the fact that they are a supervisor. Go to the next slide, Steve.
There we
Let's
go.
talk about these in detail. Do you have the ability to hire or fire? Do you have the ability to transfer employees to another job site or another work activity? Do you have the ability to suspend activities, to lay off somebody, to promote them, to assign work, to conduct discipline, or to reward them for for activities well done, right? Do you have the ability to adjust grievances? Now, all those are pretty clear, and those are traditional designations of what's a supervisor. Where it gets a little vague, or a little, not really vague, but it gets a little tricky for employees to decide whether or not they have supervisory responsibility. Are they responsibly directing the work of the employees, the other employees? And can they effectively recommend any of the above? Do they have any input into the direction, the assigning of work, the discipline, the hiring, the firing, the transfer, any of that? Those are all the key tests, the 12 tests that the NLRB has laid out to determine supervisory authority. Okay?
Very good. And Kim, before we go any further, I have to make this point.
Mm-hmm.
This is the first time I'm sure that the majority of the audience has seen or heard just what you have presented in the last few slides, okay? Unfortunately, this is something that the supervisors and employers need to know.
Right.
But there's a lot of certification courses out there that are being sold like hotcakes. And employers want to do the right thing. They want to have certifications for their foremen and their supervisions. But guess what? These certification programs, they don't even touch on what we're touching on here today. But you would think that all the time and the effort and expense that they go to, that this would be one of the chapters or the sections included in a lot of these certifications. So we're going to really hammer on this very hard, and it'll be part of the written examination, Kim, in our Ironworker Safety Supervisor Certification course, that they're going to have definitions of these that they're going to have to match up, okay? So if they're in these situations, they're going to remember. They're going to think twice, hopefully, on how to proceed on certain issues that they face in the workplace.
Absolutely. Before we move on, let's go to a couple of questions. There have been a couple of questions posed, Steve.
Sure, go ahead.
One of the questions states, if an employer has a rule that states no jewelry and the employee completes an orientation and answers the question correctly, that jewelry is not permitted but still wears jewelry, the employee is on site for a few weeks, and then the employee is confronted face-to-face by the project manager and corporate trainer, and then the following day by the superintendent, at which time the employee is terminated for failure to abide by the jewelry policy. I will tell you that's one of the strongest rights of an employer. A supervisor is the right to hire or fire an employee. Though OSHA may not have a work rule directly related to that or regulation directly, if you as the employer have a rule that states no jewelry, they have acknowledged the fact that they're aware of that rule. You have every right to pursue disciplinary action. I will tell you, and that's your benefit. There was a question earlier about employee misconduct. That is a legitimate defense for an employer anytime an employee steps outside the rule, employee misconduct, whether it's our rule or your rule. where the employer has taken every attempt to educate the employee and still there is non-compliance. In order to really uphold employee affirmative defense, the employer has to show that there is a work rule. And in this case, the question certainly states that there is a work rule. The employer has to be able to show that that work rule was communicated and understood by the employee, and absolutely the employee, if they signed off that they understood the rule, that you've demonstrated it's been trained, that they've had the edification. Lastly, the employer has to take steps and demonstrate the fact that they have implemented or attempted to implement the rule for situations of non-compliance. They have taken steps. In your instance, I'm not sure if each of those instances, the project manager, the corporate trainer, the superintendent, educated or reminded the employee that jewelry was not allowed on the job site for their own well-being. If that's the case, I would say you have a strong case for employee misconduct, and the employer can most definitely, in any instance, even under NLRB, can pursue employee discipline. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that was a good question, and that was a good answer. And I just wanted to add on to that, Kim, that if the employer has any policies and procedures that's their own, what if they want their workers to wear a company-colored hard hat? It could be pink. If that's their company policy and they want their employees to wear this color of a hard hat or high visibility vest, and it's part of their company policies and procedures, they have to do it, period. Okay, there's no question. That's part of their terms and conditions. And as you stated, it's the employer's prerogative to develop any kind of safety policies and procedures that they think is best for their employees. So that is a very strong right that the employers have. And we see that in many areas, whether it's cleanly shaven, to wear respirators or whatever, okay, on workwear that's appropriate in certain employers. So very good answer. And that's a good question. Is there another question, Kim?
There is, but one more point. I will tell you, if OSHA has a rule that states they have to have a clean-shaven face, like to wear respirators, if OSHA has a rule, the employer is required to enforce that rule because they will be held responsible, the supervisor, for not enforcing it. All right, so it's not even a question of going above and beyond the OSHA rules or employee policy. All right, there is one more question which we will get to. Do all 12 tests have to be met to be classified as a supervisor? No. The NLRB clearly states that one of the 12, if just one of the 12 is met, they're considered a supervisor under the NLRB Act.
I'd say that's a pretty blanket situation, wouldn't you, Kim?
Yes.
That with just what we've seen so far, if they do any of those, they're on the hook.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So that brings us to this slide of new definitions and key terms. And I am sure I'd like to get maybe a little honest opinion poll from the audience to say, are there many of these terms and conditions that you have been unaware of in the last 25 years? Okay, such as actual knowledge, constructive knowledge, imputed knowledge. Those are three things that the agency has to evaluate when they look at supervisors. Now, of course, we know what the definitions of a qualified person and competent person is, but then the agency has other types of authority they have to evaluate. General authority, direct responsibility authority, apparent authority. How about independent judgment? When one of your foremen or your supervisors exercises independent judgment based on their experience and knowledge in the workplace, we're going to see how that plays into the supervisory role. How about substitutional intermittent authority? One day they're a foreman, next day they're not. So this is real-time, live situations that are happening on workplaces today. And lastly, Kim mentioned the authority to adjust grievances. These are just key terms that we're going to talk about today, and that will also be included in our Ironworker Safety Supervisor certification course. So, and why don't you describe the actual knowledge definition?
Under actual knowledge, you know, you've been officially granted the title of supervisor and those responsibilities that follow. You're either through union contract or through management assignment, you have made known that you are the supervisor, you're the actual supervisor, and the actual knowledge is you saw it, you observed it, or you were informed of the condition by someone else that made you aware, but you have firsthand knowledge of the hazard existing or a hazard existing.
Very good. Here's an example of actual knowledge. And here's a case. Did the supervisor foreman know the decking bundles were landed on joists that were not welded or bridged? And here's a hazard, a serious hazard of landing loads on open web steel joists. And as you can see, all the bridging has not been installed. They're not welded to joist shoe. And also these heavy bundles of deck are not landed within 1 foot of the beam surface. So we have multiple issues here in this one photo. So the question is, when the COSHO shows up to the job site and they see this, I can almost make certain and guarantee you that they're going to ask, did the supervisor know that these decking bundles were being landed on the structure here that is a potential structural collapse hazard? So this is just an example of actual knowledge.
Steve, we have a chat question that's been asked. It says, as a foreman, am I also the competent person on the job?
I will answer that one. Not necessarily. You know, a competent person is defined by, OSHA has a definition for what is or what constitutes a competent person, and that's a designation that the employer grants an employee, right? We will ask on the job site, who is the competent person? But the competent person is one who has the knowledge, the experience to know whether a hazard exists, but more importantly, the authority and the ability to correct the hazard. So in most instances, it may be the competent person may be synonymous with the foreman, but I can think of a couple cases that we've been involved in here in Region 7 that the competent person was not necessarily the job site foreman.
Good answer. So that the answer is in not all cases to the person asking the question.
To Steve's example of actual knowledge, the compliance officer will ask you, even though they'll ask the supervisor, were you aware of the condition, right? They will ask you questions that most likely they will not ask it that directly. They will ask you, how often do you tour the job site? Where are you working? What proximity are you working in? What's the time schedule for the job to be completed? At what point did those bundles arrive on the deck? I mean, they'll get at it in an indirect way. We try very hard not to ask yes, no answers, right? Because all too often employees are nervous during a job site inspection. It may not be, whether you're the foreman or another employee, may not be all that forthcoming with information. All right.
Very good, very good. Let's go down to a term called constructive knowledge. Tim, go ahead and tee this one up.
Constructive knowledge, and OSHA relies on this a lot. I'll be the first to admit that. Constructive knowledge is you could have, should have known the existence of the hazard, right? Either by virtue of your job site inspections, by virtue of your job or your tasks on the job, being informed by someone else. Another employee came up to you and made mention of what they considered an issue. But using reasonable diligence, you were made aware or should have been aware of the existence of the hazard and appropriately taken steps to remove employees from risk. Very
good. Let's take an example of just a hypothetical situation here of constructive knowledge. Did the supervisor foreman know that the apprentice was working on an open-sided floor without perimeter safety cables? And as we can see right here, there's a lot of issues. If you look right over his back, you'll see a hole punched in the neutral axis of that column web. That's for the installation of the perimeter safety cable. So they fabricated it for the installation of perimeter safety cables, but nobody installed it. But yet, someone directed this apprentice to come out and do detail work, the flashing between the decking and the edge of the building so the concrete doesn't go down there. So they're doing detail work way before they even put in the perimeter safety cable. So this might be a case of constructive knowledge here. So Kim, do you have any comments on this?
No, I agree with you wholeheartedly. It might be a case of constructive knowledge, but it also could be actual knowledge if the supervisor were anywhere in visibility or could see the lack of perimeter guarding.
And you could see this one right across the street, okay?
Yeah.
Open-sided floor. So it's a situation, unfortunately, where people get in too big of a hurry. They don't follow the flow of the project and when they have to install these cables.
Right.
Now, how about imputed knowledge? Go ahead and describe this one, please, Kim.
Imputed knowledge is you as the foreman, you've gained information that a hazard may exist from another source or another person. Maybe it's a subcontractor, a lead man for a subcontractor. Maybe it's the host, the job site host. But you should be aware of the hazard based on the workflow process, based on who's supposed to be coming on site, based on your work site activities, but it's imputed to you from another source. And unfortunately, if you refer to the multi-employer citation policy for the agency, imputed knowledge is what's used a great deal to transfer or to show authority and responsibility from one contractor to another, whether you are the exposing, the controlling, the creating contractor. It's used a great deal to show knowledge on the part of a corporation or of a general contractor.
Very good. So let's take a little example here. It was known from other sources that the supervisor foreman allowed floor openings to be unprotected on the job site, okay? Maybe it's been a long-standing knowledge of all the subs, everyone on the job site, that at no time these temporary floor openings were ever covered. Now, we understand that we have to leave sheets out to do the welding, and that's the case here. You can't weld it up and it can't be inspected or fully bolted or retrofit on this connection with the sheet in there. However, you can't leave unprotected floor openings on a project, on a walking working surface. And one of the questions is, well, what is the trigger height for floor openings? There is no trigger height, whether it's 6 feet, 15, 30, it just says all exposed floor openings must be covered, period. So this is a case where they had a history and everyone knew that they had absolutely no intentions or materials to cover this floor opening on a multi-story building. And you can see the column splices there where it's going to go up 22 floors. Kim, do you have any comments on this slide?
No, I think that's a good definition. And it clearly shows that the employer, the supervisor, should have known from past experience, from contractors or employees that are working at that level, workflow process, absolutely.
So just to reiterate, in this case, you could have had actual knowledge, constructive knowledge, and imputed knowledge all at the same time, right, Kim?
Exactly, exactly. And why Steve is going over all of these is y'all should know that in order for OSHA to issue a citation, we have to show employer knowledge. We have to show a hazard. We have to show that there's a means of abating or eliminating that hazard. But most importantly, we have to show employer knowledge. And that's where the supervisors, whether the supervisor's role comes into play a great deal, whether it's imputed, constructive, or actual knowledge. That's why it's most important that you're fully aware of the conditions of your job site, what your responsibilities as a supervisor are, and that you have the ability, the willingness, the desire to take action to remove employees from risk.
Very, very well put. Okay, now we're going to get down into cases of just general authority, because there are situations where our members, our iron workers, and your employees, contractors, merely have just general authority. So Kim kind of touched on this earlier, but Kim, go ahead and read through these bullet points if you would, please.
To determine whether or not general authority, we take a look at what's the individual's correct title. What is your title? And we will always ask that. What is your job title, right? And then next question, what do you do? What are some of your responsibilities? How and where does the individual fall in the organization, the employer's organization or operational structure? What is the individual being held responsible for the employer? And this is what, or by the employer, and this is what Steve alluded to early on. It's very important, and that's where a lot of the contests come in on OSHA citations, unfortunately, even after fatalities, is the employer really aware of the responsibilities they're placing on that employee when they place them in the role of foreman or supervisor? The individual, for what is that employer believe they're holding the employee responsible for, and then in actuality, what are they holding him responsible for in the eyes of the law? Is the individual the highest ranking individual present on the job site at a shift or at any point in time? That has a lot of bearing. In OSHA's inspections, the highest ranking official management is a model to the other employees. So the higher up we go, the more insidious the employer knowledge is, and we will look for that. We'll try and take it up as far as we can go, whether it's the CEO, the manager, the owner, whoever it might be. What classifications report to the individual? Who reports? Do you have any direct reports? Do you have any indirect reports? To whom do you give authority, responsibility, or assign tasks? To whom does the individual report to? Does the supervisor or the individual report directly to the owner, the manager, the CEO? Do they report to the safety and health manager? Do they report to the general? Who do they report to? We're trying to determine the extent of employer knowledge, and that's where general authority comes into play. How does the employee's duties vary from the person's working immediately over or under them? Can we demonstrate that even though they may say they don't have any supervisory responsibilities as listed by the NLRB, have they taken any? Have they the apparent authority to direct the activities of the employees that they're working over or under them?
Say we've got two things that popped up in the chat that I think directly relate to this. One was a comment. It says a competent person must be designated by the employer as such.
Yes.
And flowing from that, we have a question, another comment question. It says general authority. How should the employer document that they trained or inform the employee they have that has the authority on the job?
You know, the sad point, you're absolutely right. The competent person has to be designated by the employer. And if OSHA, I'll go back to that question. It's not an OSHA designation. It's your designation, meeting the employer's designation, meeting the intent of the rule. That's where it's defined in 1926. I think it's 32. If we get to a job site and there is required by law, one of OSHA rules, regulations, to have a competent person, no one steps forward as a competent person, then of course OSHA takes action that there was no competent person on site, and we'll move forward with the supervisor or foreman, allowing employees to be exposed to hazards and take actions there. Under general authority, how should the employer document their training? We don't have a requirement that talks about, there is no OSHA regulation that says as a supervisor the employee has to have this degree of training, this amount of training, this categories of training. That's really left up to the employer to decide how to train them. But I would highly recommend that they go over what the NLRB regulations state as those 12 indices and what determines a manager or a supervisor, what authorities they have, what the work rules are for the employer, and then of course, absolutely, what are the OSHA work rules that may come into contact or into play on the job site. But we don't have a set forum or a set agenda for managers, management to demonstrate that that supervisor has been trained. Though it's in the best interest of the employer to have documentation related to the training and to document what authorities they have given or not given to that supervisor. However, remember the constructive and the imputed training, and we'll talk about apparent authority coming up. Even if the employer has said you don't have the authority to transfer, you do not have the authority to stop a job, and the employee stops the job and the employer does nothing, rather condones the activities of that employer, then the supervisor is still looked at as the extension of management, is acting in the best interest of management. So the more documentation you have to support what you have or have not trained, told your supervisors and what authority they have, the better off you will be. But it's really like the competent person. It's up to you to decide.
Yes, and to kind of add to this, all the documentation can help employers with affirmative defense of unpreventable employee misconduct, correct?
Correct.
In some cases. Now, in order to prove that, all the employers, there's 4 things that you must have, and have these before you call me, please, is you have to have a written program that that addresses the workplace hazards that they do. Number 2, the employer has to adequately communicate the safety policies and procedures to their employees. Number 3, the employer has to conduct workplace inspections on a frequent and periodic basis. And number 4, this administrative law judge determined this in a case, that the employer has to show that they enforce their company safety policies. It's just not a Betty Crocker cookbook safety program sitting on the corner of your desk collecting dust. It's about this thick that they got from some insurance carrier that talks about everything from soup to nuts, but really they're not doing any of it.
Right.
So those are just some things about unpreventable employee misconduct and how it's important, as Kim said, to document everything you're doing. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Kim?
I do. Be mindful of the fact that if the misconduct is coming from the person designated as the supervisor,
Yes.
it's much more challenging for an employer to say that my supervisor was acting up or was not following the work rules, because
Right.
they are an extension of you.
Right.
So it's a little more challenging to display. And again, audit, discipline, remove them from supervisory status. Because as I mentioned earlier, and I'm sure Steve is going to get to it, it's apparent authority. If the employer does not take steps to correct missteps by a designated supervisor or even a implied supervisor, giving them the authority, they condone their behavior, then the misconduct offense for a manager is out the window.
Correct. Absolutely. In fact, Kim, I would say it'd be my position in about 99% of the cases, if we have a supervisor or foreman that's in direct sight of the violation or the fatality or the incident, they don't have any recourse of unpreventable employee misconduct. You take that completely off their plate once you, the agency, established that this was a supervisor, he is a company management representative, and he failed to carry out their orders. So then, in that case, many of the cases, the employer has no defense because their foreman didn't respond appropriately. So that kind of seems the situation, how it usually plays out.
Right.
We have 2 things in our Q&A box. One is a thank you from Mike Baker to Kim for taking time out of her busy day to join us. Mike Baker's president of District North Central States District Council. The other one's a question. Are supervisors citable and under what conditions?
Generally, we don't cite individual employees, even a supervisor. The only instance where that may take place is if there has been a fatality. OSHA has issued a willful citation. There might be a referral made to the Department of Justice to seek criminal sanctions, and that could go against a supervisor, a manager, as well as the company in general. And that has happened.
Yes. That's a good question. And from a federal level, Kim's absolutely correct. However, when you get into different states that operate under state-approved OSHA plans that have their own labor codes, such as California,
right?
They have labor codes out here that have instituted criminal prosecution against supervisors in the workplace. That means industrial, manufacturing, petrochemical, and of course, construction. Now, what makes this worse is the threshold for criminal prosecution used to be negligence, that the district attorneys would have to prove that Kim Steely or Pete Hayes was willfully negligent in putting that person into an excavation and they got buried alive. However, that burden of proof by certain attorneys found it too difficult. That level of burden was too much effort. So what did they do? They lowered the threshold for criminal prosecution from having to prove willful just down to prove negligence. So here in the great state of California, they only have to prove that Kim or Pete was just merely negligent. And then they are subject to criminal prosecution under the labor code. Very unfortunate, but yet another reason why we have to address this at all levels, nationwide, and particularly in cases like California that have these kind of statutes in labor code. So
there is one more question, Steve.
Okay.
Can the employer hold a supervisor accountable?
Yeah.
Absolutely, but it goes back to our discussion on employee misconduct. If it's a supervisory misconduct.
Yeah.
Do not condone bad behavior. Take actions.
Right.
Move them.
I'll tell you what, the owner of the company, management, will hold their supervisors accountable if they can't complete the job, if they can't do the job, if they can't show up on time, or if they're incompetent, or if that's not their skill set, they would replace them like that.
Right.
So yes, they can remove them for safety reasons as well as just productivity and skill reasons. Okay. Right. So that goes along with it too. So Kim, we're here on the topic of independent judgment now, this term, and how it directly relates to decisions that our supervisors, our foremen, general foremen, and superintendents can take in the workplace. So if you would cover these bullet points.
Absolutely. Independent judgment is you as a supervisor. In most cases, you as a supervisor were selected as a supervisor because you have the most experience, the most knowledge in the job. So if you are allowed as a supervisor to use your own independent judgment, you decide how to complete a task, whether it's the number of people, whether it's the individual steps to complete it, when, how, what type of equipment to use. You are exercising independent judgment. And you are definitely the supervisor. The alternative would be is if someone from above, whether it's a manager, a CEO, someone else has told you exactly, like a recipe, exactly how to complete the task, what employees to use, when and how to do it, what equipment to use, then it's not an exercise of independent judgment, but merely routine or clerical in nature, and you would not be considered a supervisor in most instances.
Very good. And here's another case of independent judgment. Okay. I'm sorry, did you cover all these bullet points right here adequately?
I did.
Okay.
Well, it's up to them.
Okay, here's just a case that we could run into of independent judgment, and this has happened in many cases. Did the foreman supervisor exercise his or her judgment to set columns on green concrete that had insufficient strength? Even when the anchor bolts were pulling out of the concrete, as you see here, they were pulling out, the concrete was green, and they even cut steel plate to use as washers because the anchor bolts, the redheads, were pulling right out of the concrete. So in this case, that supervisor, that foreman exercised their reasonable judgment, their independent judgment to go ahead and set these columns, even though the concrete was green. And Kim, this is a perfect example of a structural collapse waiting to happen, because we have found that column anchorage is paramount on preventing structural collapse. That's why we went to all the lengths to have the subpart R standards reflect that you can't even begin erection on concrete structures, footings, piers, or walls if the concrete hasn't attained at least 75% of the design strength. Okay. And number two, all columns have to be equipped with 4 anchor bolts. So those are some things that are very serious here, and this is a case of independent judgment. Do you have anything to add to this photo, Kim?
No, very well versed. Thank you.
Next is, now we get into the responsibility direct. And Kim, if you could kind of impart on this, how the NLRB weighs in on responsibility direct.
The NLRB, as the slide states, distinguishes quite heavily between employees, supervisors, who direct the manner of the work to be done versus those who direct the actual employees. If an employee is an individual typically is found to have supervisory authority if they have direct oversight for those employees. They direct the employees on how to perform the tasks using their independent judgment exercising any discretion they may have based on their experience and their knowledge, and it's not simply rote, clerical, or I would say cookbook, right? They hold the responsibility and accountability for the performance of the task. So there is a big difference in NLRB. What level of authority do you have? Just the completion of the task, or the employees that are completing the task?
Very well. Well put. Here's a classic example. Let's say you used your independent judgment to assign 5 employee ironworkers to disassemble 120 foot of the vertical mast of a tower crane, and you are held responsible for their work. You are a supervisor, okay? If you're designated for overseeing those people dismantling that crane, you're not only a supervisor, you're what they call the disassembly director in this particular case. However, if your supervisor told you, another person, to use 5 ironworker employees to do the disassembly work and a serious incident occurs and you're not held responsible, then you're most likely you would not be considered a supervisor. Because if Kim's a supervisor and she says, hey, Steve, I need you to go over and do this, it doesn't automatically mean that I am I have direct responsibility here, because I'm not exercising my independent judgment. I'm following orders from Kim, who is the supervisor. Kim, do you have any comments on this?
No, I think that's very clear. Again, it goes back to, are you directing the people or are you directing the task? And what authority have you exercised, or what's condoned? Right?
Good point.
There's a question posted, Steve, and I'm going to turn this one over to you. This looks an awful lot like a journeyman-apprentice relationship, apprenticeship relationship.
What looks like a journeyman?
I'm assuming the ability to exercise direct responsibility or authority.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I would say, yeah, because our seasoned journeyman to watch out for the apprentices. That's why we like to assign apprentices to work with journeymen, so that they don't do anything that can hurt themselves or someone else. So, yeah, this is a good example of the journeyman apprentice relationship, okay, and how they cannot put anyone in an unsafe condition or unsafe act. So, yeah, good question.
Very good.
I have a question pertaining to that. Would the designation, and I know some locals actually have this in their CBA, of the term lead man? Let's say the foreman tells ex-journeyman to go do this and take these 2 apprentices with you, and he's either being paid or is somehow designated lead man. Does that put that person as a supervisor role? How would they view that?
It depends again upon their authority, what they've been instructed, what they have the ability to do or not do, whether it's actual, constructive, or apparent authority. But it could. And you will see the NLRB in some of their decisions. In the cases, they use the terms interchangeably: leadman, job site foreman, supervisor. So you have to be very clear from the employer perspective of what authorities you're giving in action and in voice the supervisors, the employees that you are designating or you've allowed to function as leadman, foreman, supervisor.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and I'll throw in a plug for foreman, superintendent, safety director, all the training that's going on. It's so imperative to get your employees involved in this, because what we're seeing, at least out on the street level or out on the job sites, is as baby boomers are retiring, we're seeing a loss or a brain drain of foremen and leadership people. So we're seeing a lot of young men and women who are maybe 5-10-year JIWs becoming these, going into these roles of foreman, lead man, all these things. So training is so imperative.
Absolutely. There was a follow-up question, Steve. Does the definition, does that impute supervisory authority on the journeyman, even if the journeyman is not a designated supervisor?
Oh, that's a really good question.
I would argue not from the agency perspective, because the
Yes.
foreman, the supervisor, whoever has designated that individual as in charge or on-the-job training for that apprentice, and
Yes.
does not exercise all of the authority or the authorities of a supervisor. right?
That's correct.
It's more of a training mode.
It is. It is. So that's a good question, because we do fall into that situation every day.
Right. Oh, I'm sure you do. Mhm.
Yeah. So here's
But
a
I will
slide.
tell you, be mindful. We recently, OSHA just had, I'm sorry, Steve.
No,
but
go ahead.
OSHA had a fatality in which an employee was being trained, and the individual, the trainer, stepped aside to respond to a phone inquiry, turned his back to the individual being trained, and he was driving a skid steer, and unfortunately he drove it and drove it over a second employee. So pinned them between that and a piece of equipment that they were working on. So be mindful of that supervisory journeyman apprentice relationship, and that you are fulfilling your job as a journeyman in terms of training.
That's correct. That's correct. Here's a photograph of just an example of direct supervisor responsibility. It's someone who is responsible for evaluating his employees, as Kim mentioned, held responsible by the employer for the work of those employees. I can assure you that a foreman, a raising gang foreman, will, and the highest ranking individual present at any time on any shift. So here's a common situation we have, where the foreman on the erection floor, 18 floors up, has directed ironworkers where to land concentrated loads that are coming from the truck from the street. So the question is the structure fully bolted and welded to support the dead load? And that person of authority that's scheduling in and landing iron in this section, they have to have that knowledge and expertise to make that determination. Yes, let's take iron, let's land it here, land it close to the beam side, the column line, for added support. And so this is a situation of direct supervisor responsibility.
We actually have another question in the chat that I think should be asked so everyone understands. It appears to be coming from someone with one of the ironworker locals. This person writes, with our local, under the CBA, the local is required to train the individuals. How is that covered under OSHA, and what responsibilities the contractors still have?
Okay, I can kind of address that. Nowhere in the Act does it say that the local union is responsible for employee and instruction. Everywhere in the Act, from 1926, in the very first part, point 26, 28, it says the employer shall do this, the employer shall initiate programs, the employer shall conduct workplace inspections. Nowhere in the Act does it say that the local union has any responsibility for training employees. However, what employers can do, and what we encourage them to do, is to take advantage through the apprenticeship tracking program, all the documentations when Pete and Kim is trained on scaffolding, on fall protection, on multiple lift rigging. They can document that we have all been trained in these areas. So it's an added bonus to our employers to take advantage of this, okay? So we're not responsible for on the hook from the agency to train them, but when we do, the employer can document that I have had training in this and ensure that before I start doing the multiple lift rigging procedure, like you see right here on the screen, that I've received that training, okay? And this is a case here that I wanted to mention, that on this project, the connectors were performing multiple lift rigging with insufficient clearance between the beams in direct view of the raising gang foreman, who is considered to be a supervisor, okay? Now I have to tell you, this procedure is not liked by the agency. They hate it. So when they come out and they're sitting across the street and they see a connector having to duck under the beam here, it's really easy for them to see that they don't have sufficient clearance, which is what? 7 feet between the top flange of the bottom piece to the bottom flange of the top piece. So from iron to iron, you have to have 7 feet. So in this case, yes, that raising gang foreman is a supervisor and has complete control and custody over these connectors and the hook-on guys working in the raising gang. And unfortunately, this is a situation where they didn't have the right slings length, and it constituted a violation of the subpart R standard because there isn't sufficient clearance, okay? About apparent authority, and mention that. So Kim, why don't you reiterate this and maybe give an example?
Typically, there's what we call actual authority. Someone's officially told you that you are the supervisor for the job site for that day, for that week, whatever, the entire project. But there's also apparent authority where no one has officially said, Steve, you're going to be the supervisor on this job. I have to step off to a second site. However, you have made assignments, you have taken actions, you have assigned work activities, you've told them how, when, what to do, how to get it done in particular. And the manager, the CEO, the safety and health director, nobody has corrected the fact that you are not the official supervisor. They have condoned the activity by not saying anything, not taking action. So you have a parent, or you have apparent authority, and would be considered the supervisor by OSHA and NLRB.
Mm-hmm. And Kim, we've talked about this before, but in some cases, in a lot of cases, we have a fluid workforce. Mm-hmm. Who's working as a foreman for one of our contractors today could be working for another one next month, but then they could come right back. When another employer has more work, that same foreman that worked for him before will come right back to work for him again, okay? And even though the employer doesn't say, okay, Billy, you're back working with me, I'm not going to reiterate everything. In this case of apparent authority, if they've been a foreman for him before, and they're coming back, and yet there's no discussion between the two, this is a case where they have apparent authority, right?
Absolutely. And I will caution you, and Steve alluded to the fact that they show up intermittently on different job sites as a supervisor under apparent authority. The agency tries very hard to document who is considered the supervisor, the foreman, the lead man, whatever it might be on individual job sites. So if we show up at a job site and we have documented that this supervisor, who we believe has actual knowledge of a hazard existing, also served as supervisor on a previous job site in which hazards were identified. I mean, that goes a long way for employer knowledge and progresses to the fact that you've done nothing to remove them from supervisory authority. You've condoned their, for lack of a better word, poor behavior, and now you're moving into the realm of not only repeat but also willful violations because you're allowing them to continue. So I would be very mindful of that apparent authority when you have an instance where a supervisor is not necessarily acting in your best interest, but you've done nothing to correct that behavior.
Kim, I have to allude to a specific case without mentioning the employer.
Okay.
And this was the poster child of why we're really doing all of this.
Correct.
An employer had a fatality, and it was found out that their supervision or foreman did nothing. About 4 to 6 months later, the agency in another city saw the same contractor in the same hazard violating the very same fall protection standard. So the agency went in, as you described, they did their inspection, and they made notice, and they asked who the supervisor was. Well, guess what OSHA found out? It's not only the same contractor, steel erector, but it's the very same foreman that was involved in the fatality in another city. And so the agency, just as you said, the employer took no action to make sure that that person understood their roles and responsibilities as a supervisor, and yet it happened again. And in that case, the agency said, this is enough, this constitutes willful, and we're going to bump this up to the DA for let them handle it, correct?
Correct.
So it's very important, and it's incumbent on our contractors to make sure that they understand their responsibilities to communicate with these foremen on a periodic and frequent basis.
Right. This is the authority that comes back to haunt people, is the apparent authority. So make sure you stay on top of that. Yeah.
Yes.
We actually have a comment in the chat too. Someone just comments, says apparent authority seems to equal lead man. And I would kind of go on top of that. You go out on the job, and it's not unusual for a foreman to tell a lead man or a journeyman, a guy who's not getting paid anymore, take these two people, go over here and install this angle or do this. Does that not make that person an authority. When the foreman tells him, take 2 people or take whatever, go do this task, we put that person in a position of authority, apparent authority.
Well, not really, because they're not using their independent judgment. I would argue that it's a cookie cutter. It's a recipe. They're being told the instructions are being prescripted to them by the foreman. In that instance, the lead man is told what employees to use, what tasks to do, and probably even how to do it. So I would argue that doesn't make them the lead man a supervisor, but merely following instructions or orders.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. I know that's big out in the construction world. You see a lot of that going on daily. So
I'm sure. Mm-hmm.
Well, Kim, thank you for your answer to that. And could I retain you as an expert witness to defend us in the future on that point?
Again, document. Who told them? What they tell them? When did they tell them? And what did they tell them to do?
Yeah. I'm going to subpoena you to reiterate this point. Okay. I'm just teasing. Well, thanks, Kim.
There's 3 things in the Q&A box too. The first one, Steve, I'm sure you can answer. Mark Calkins is the business manager of Local 24 Denver, has just asked, when will the Ironworker Supervisor certification course be available? And is it third-party tested or within the organization?
Good question. Thanks, Mark. Hi, Mark. We are in the development stage right now. We look to roll it out next July in Ann Arbor in conjunction and at the direction of the National Training Fund, Lee Worley. Okay. All programs through the National Fund run across his desk. This Ironworker Safety Supervisor certification course will be accredited. The written program will be accredited by the International Accreditation Services, IAS. And each ironworker that completes this will actually get a certification from them that they've completed the written exam, they've the procedures that the International Accreditation Services audits and requires, okay? And they are a huge third-party accreditation firm that works for the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, all over the world, okay? So they come very highly recommended and they have high esteem with upholding their certifications. So, and it'll be, Mark, just to let you know, it'll be a hell of a lot more than 50 or 100 questions that have nothing to do with steel erection. These are going to be anywhere from 250 to 350 questions, photographs. It's going to be a test of competency. It's a competency-based test. So all of our supervisors taking this course will have to demonstrate that they are able to recognize a hazard in this photo and also say what would be their corrective action, whether it's a floor opening, open-sided floor, improper rigging, whatever the case is. We're going to try to take it from A to Z and put as many common situations for our supervisors to that. Then we're going to document it. So that's one of the things that we're doing, we're forced to do, because we have to step up and make this certification course much better. You had a second question, Pete?
Well, yeah, and there's several that have jumped on with that. One asked if there's going to be a database where a contractor can screen those supervisors. That lays right into what you're talking about. It sounds like that'll be part of it.
Yeah, it'll be no different than you, Pete, saying, hey, I need someone that has their welding certification papers, because you're not going to call someone if they don't, right? You're going to call someone who's a qualified rigger, who's a certified rigger now, because I need this. So it'll be a specific designation that you're looking for, as well as the safety certification that you can ask for. And yes, there will be a pool. They'll have this on the apprenticeship tracking system. So every member will have this course underneath their belt with many other courses. And so with a QR code reader, you can pull up their card through an iPad or your iPhone and see, does Billy, Jimmy, and Johnny have this certification? Yes or no? So it'll be easy for you to document.
All right. Someone else asked when the next Ironworker Safety Director training course is.
Okay. We've had 7 of those around the United States and Canada. We've had over 506 members and contractor safety people complete this course. And we're really pleased to announce that we have several people that have gotten full-time jobs with people like General Motors, the Disney Corporation, SME steel erectors, with many, many employees from coast to coast. And these are iron workers that we are grooming to fill positions as a full-time designated safety person, okay? Not a supervisor, but a full-time safety person. Who's going to handle 180 iron workers in 3 states on 14 jobs? Do they have the skill set to do all the documentation of inspections, verifying training, contract safety documents? Can they put it all together and work with the people in the field, with owners and general contractors? So to answer the question, we are going to schedule one for 2020. I had a discussion with Wayne Cressup, our newly hired safety department district rep, and we're going to offer this in 2020. It'll probably be in May, I'm guessing, early June, somewhere in the United States that's readily accessible to everybody, okay? So thank you for that question. So now we're down to this situational intermittent authority, okay? We have situations where maybe I get a call from the school. I'm a single parent and my kid is sick or they're in trouble. I have to leave the job site. I turn the job site over to Kim. Say, Kim, I got to go. It's an emergency. Got to get to school. Does that automatically mean that Kim Steely is now the designated and the supervisor? And does that mean that Kim is going to be held responsible as a supervisor and a company management representative? Kim, address this, please.
It depends on exactly how often, what they do when they're in that role, and whether or not they are the highest ranking individual. I stated in the slide, which I have the chat questions up. How often is it? Is it sporadically? Is it one day a month? Is it one day a year? Is it every other week? Is it multiple times throughout the week, the month, the year, whatever it might be? But so we take a look at how often do they function in that role. Individually, what do they do when they're in that role? What authority do they have? Have they been told or have they been allowed to hire, fire, suspend any one of those 12 indices, adjust grievances, and whether or not they are the highest ranking individual? So I'm trying very hard to stay away from that pat answer, OSHA answer. It depends, but it truly depends on what you've allowed, you as the employer have allowed them to do and how often.
That's correct. And I have to say, in defense of a lot of our members in this situation that work for smaller employers, this happens. Okay, they have to leave and they turn it over to Billy, Jimmy, or Johnny. Okay, and just say, look, you got to take over. I got to leave, and it happens that quick. Okay, but they've never been in a position to running a job. They're just completing the day between 1 o'clock and 3:30 when they get off. Okay, so that's a situation that comes up. But here we are, the authority to adjust grievances, okay? So Ken, please address this.
If you have the ability to adjust a grievance, whether they're complaining of work hours, you can send people home, you give them overtime, you allow them to leave the job early. If you have any say-so in, or if you've done anything to adjust what the grievances are, again, that's one of the 12 indices that NLRB laid out as a supervisory function. So if you have that authority, you're a supervisor.
Yes, very well. Even sending people home early. That happens a lot. If you get rained out, say, sorry, man, we don't have the crane the rest of the day and there's nothing else to do, so we got to dog it off at 1:15. Okay. Hiring authority. Same thing here. To hit this briefly, is the individual involved in hiring? Does this fluid workforce go to one job site to job site, go up to the superintendent and say, hey, we just completed the job, so I just want to come by and see if you need any welders, bolt up hands, raising gang, hook on guys, whatever. So if that person working, say, for Pete here says, yeah, I've been working shorthanded, I'll put you right in the gang, welcome back. So if that person can very well have hiring authority. Ability to transfer. Tim, why don't you address this briefly?
Again, this goes back to those 12 indices. If the individual, he's not working out, he has misconduct, you transfer him to another job. All right, if you've made that decision to transfer him, if you've reviewed or had any insight with the manager, the safety and health director, had any role in the transfer of that employee to another job site, another company, whatever it might be, then you have exercised the supervisory authority as laid out by NLRB.
That's correct. Absolutely. And we have a lot of foremen that will tell people, you can't make it in my gang, but you can go work in the decking gang.
Right.
Okay. That happens. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
How about
So
this?
we've got, Steve, when you have a minute, we got more questions building in. So finish your
All right.
thought and we'll jump on.
Go ahead. I'm on a new slide here. So what's the
Sure.
question?
Well, there's one here that's pertinent right now, and then some others we'll get onto. If a new hire is designated a supervisor and paid as such, but only works in the crew, is he or she a supervisor or not? And I think that might fall into someone's hired to be a foreman. The job might not start for 2 weeks. So for 2 weeks, they're on another job waiting for their project to start. Is that person a supervisor, even if they're being paid as such, but they're only working in the crew? Or my job got rained out, I'm going to go over to Jim's job because he's got inside work. I'm no longer a foreman when I get there. Am I still designated to supervisor because I was on job A, but now I'm over on job B?
I'd say what Kim has laid out before us, he was paid as a supervisor. He will be working in a supervisory capacity, even though he has a supervisor over him. The agency can prove that Jimmy was indeed a full-time supervisor and merely rolled over into another job. I think that could be made very clear. Kim, would you agree or disagree?
Well, I could see both stances, but we would take the argument that he is an extension of management because he was hired and retained and given the authority of a supervisor.
And paid as
And paid. Even though he may not have exercised that authority as a supervisor, he's still in that classification. That goes back to some of that documentation we would request when we did the opening the inspection. What is your organizational layout? What are the jobs and duties, the job titles, the responsibilities?
Right. And
Okay.
Go ahead, Pete. What's your next question?
Here's one that says, as supervisors are designated, are succession or secondary supervisors also appointed in the absence of first line supervisors?
Well, I would say if the second tier supervisors are given specific instruction by the employer under the terms and conditions that we've already laid out thus far, I would say you have to evaluate do these second tier supervisors meet that criteria. Kim, what's your thoughts?
Of course, OSHA would look to on any job site, we would look to, again, who is in charge of the job site. If the first line supervisor is gone, but they've in absentia allowed a second line supervisor, secondary supervisor to step up and given the authority to function in that role, we would look to them as the extension of management.
Okay. Another one, does correcting a safety hazard constitute resolving a grievance?
I would say so. I'd say it could. Like if I came to Kim and I said, Kim, I've been working on this floor and I cannot get the decking foreman to cover up any of these floor openings for 6 bays. And I came to you, Pete, or to Kim to express that I have a grievance that nobody is covering up these fall hazards in these floor openings. So take it from there.
Well, you're obviously required by law to correct any hazard, but
Right.
if it's a grievance or related to a grievance, I would say yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Pete,
Go ahead.
here's a question I just got to take.
Yeah.
Will the Kansas City Chiefs beat the Colts at home next week? Yes, absolutely. Yes. I want to make that real clear. So anybody who wants to take bets, I'll give you 4 points.
Will the Kansas City Chiefs beat the Green Bay Packers in a few weeks after that? No.
I won't take that bet. No.
So there's a question that was in the box that has disappeared. I'm not sure why, but I think I can hit it. And it's going to be for Kim. I'm sure she's been asked this hundreds of times. It was asked, when is OSHA going to begin to hold employees responsible when they clearly break rules that are clearly established by the employer and well known in the industry?
Never.
Well, That's a very interesting question. I was just on a conversation with a counterpart in Canada earlier this morning, and they do issue citations to employees in Canada. However, federal OSHA here in the United States has never taken that step to issue a citation to an employee for a hazard created or one that they may have created, caused, or been privy to. Not that the OSHA Act doesn't require, because you're absolutely right, Section 5B does state that the employees should adhere to all OSHA regulations, any safety and health rules or regulations. The federal OSHA attitude is that you as the employer are there, and Steve laid out the employee misconduct offenses. You as the employer, it's your responsibility to ensure that the employees are well aware of what those regulations are through written or a policy. You have audited the job site to ensure that they understand what their role in the correction of hazards is, and that you've taken steps non-compliance where there's issues of non-compliance. One of the greatest rights of an employer is to discipline, hire, or fire employees who just can't seem to walk the line with respect to compliance with safety and health policies.
You're absolutely, and they cannot fail to do that when it happens. Okay, it doesn't mean that an employer has to fire all the time. It means they have to take corrective action and document that the employer told Billy, Jimmy, or Johnny that this is my policy and this is a written verbal warning, right, Kim?
Right, absolutely. And be mindful, to Steve's point, be mindful of severity of the hazard. If it's a fall hazard, the impact on other employees. You can't imagine the number of fatalities that take place, not to the employee who caused or created the hazardous condition, but to coworkers working in the area. So absolutely, you need to make sure that employees are very well versed on what the hazards are, how to correct, and the steps to take, and that their role in compliance.
Yes.
Okay. Another one quick, would it be prudent for contractors to require the JIW to successfully complete the foreman training course as an investment in individual JIW? And I think that stems back to contractors being, of course, as we know, it's a labor management board on the JTC. So would that be a requirement that we think would be worthwhile, that all journeyman iron workers would go through some sort of foreman course so they have at least a minimal level of training if they end up in that role, because foreman leaves because he's got a dentist appointment and leaves that lead man in charge.
Right. The thought on that situation, that question, Pete, is President Dean is looking at this Ironworker Safety Certification course. Once we complete the pilot program in California, for all you folks, we're going to complete the pilot program, get feedback, tweak it, and roll it out next year in Ann Arbor. We want this to be available to everyone, and somewhere down the road, the decision on May, hopefully, is before you graduate out of your 4-year apprenticeship school, every member will have taken this course, okay? It's a prerequisite, okay? So, because you're right, Pete, they will fall into these situations sooner or later. We want them to know, okay? So, answer your question is, this may roll into a prerequisite prior to graduation in the future. That's all I can say.
Okay, thank you. That's it for now on questions.
Okay, good. Authority to lay off, same situation here. There's raising gang foremen that if you can't cut it for them, they'll say, hey, dude, your check's waiting for you down in the shack. And by the time you get down the elevator into the shack, your check's almost there waiting for you. Okay, so yes, there are foremen that can get your money and run you off quickly. And that's a situation where they do have the authority to lay off and would constitute a supervisor in the workplace. Authority to promote, reward, maybe. But they're going to ask the question, do they have the authority to grant overtime to employees? Sometimes. Some people get to work overtime and some don't. Question is who makes that decision? Was it that foreman, general foreman, superintendent? Authority to discharge. Yep, we agree. We talked about that just a second ago. They can get your money. They can have the authority to say you can't make it here. Authority to assign responsibility direct. Okay, who's making that decision? That I want Pete to take over this detail gang to do this, okay? I want Pete to go do all the heavy rigging, okay? Let's talk about some upside examples here, okay, of supervisor responsibility. Common things. How about maintaining a tightly planked or deck floor every 2 floors or 30 feet, whichever is less during the steel erection process? That has been standard in Subpart R since 1971 when the OSHA Act was written, okay? And then it was rewritten and through negotiated rulemaking, and this standard was continued on as a good, safe standard during the steel erection process. But here's the question. Look at this picture. Look at all the open iron. They didn't maintain a tightly planked deck floor. So what if the foreman decided to continue erecting the building while he had the crane, and you see the yellow crane off to the left there, and did not take the time to maintain or install decking, planking, or nets as required by Subpart R steel erection, okay? And the big one happens. One of the iron workers from the top of the structure drops a bolt pin, a drift pin, spud wrenches, sleever bar, whatever, and it falls all the way down through the building and it hits someone, another trade. There's no platform to catch falling object, as in the preamble of Subpart R. There is no platform for rescue if you're tied off and it can't get you down if you have heat illness. And there's no decking there to prevent excessive fall distances. But this has become an issue all across the United States, where employers have substituted their discretion for that of the standard. And they're also using an OSHA compliance directive that says, if you provide 100% fall protection, in this case, employer doesn't have to maintain a tightly planked and deck floor. So consequently, we're seeing serious injuries and fatalities occurring and third-party liability suits because of this particular situation where they want to wreck the building, get the crane off the job as fast as possible, and not put in the deck to comply with the standard. And nowhere in the standard or the preamble does it give any recognition or alternative means for complying with the standard. It doesn't say that you can provide 100% fall protection on this. So the question is who is the supervisor and why did he or she take their independent judgment, as we discussed earlier, to not maintain a tightly planked and deck floor? And believe me, that question will be directed to them, okay? And they're going to have to ask, why did you elect to just use the crane and not have the decking gang come up right behind you, okay? So this is a question of direct supervision and their action to use their own independent judgment, okay? How about shear connectors? What if we have a standard that says you can't erect beams that the shear studs erect vertically from or horizontally across the top flange of any structural member, like a beam here? Okay. So what happens if they say, well, the beams came to the job with the shear studs already shop fabricated to them, so I went ahead and erected them anyway. And let's say someone tripped on all these double row of shear studs on these top flanges of these beams, and they fall. And they break their neck because they hit their head on the way down, even though they're tied off 100%, okay? The question is going to be is why did he or she go ahead and continue to erect these field beams and headers with shear studs that have been shop attached when it's a no-no? It's a blatant disregard of Subpart R that says you cannot erect beams with shear studs that have been shop fabricated. You have to install them like this picture shows after the metal decking has been installed. Then you come back and then you shoot all the shear studs down with a gun like this, okay? So once again, there's this position that as long as the employer provides 100% fall protection, that you can erect beams with shear studs or other similar devices on it. Can't do it. Why? Because under Subpart R, OSHA has a very specific standard called tripping hazard. And in that, it specifically addresses shear studs, deformed anchors, or other similar devices that could constitute a trip hazard and a fall. And why do we adopt this standard? Because we looked at 673 fatalities when we rewrote Subpart R. And you know what we found? That tripping on shear studs was one of the primary causation factors. Bridge girders, beams like this, that it wasn't just a lack of fall protection that caused it, okay? Wasn't the root cause. It was the fact that their Carhartts, their lanyards, their safety harnesses, their boots they tripped on these shear studs, working on them 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, 160 hours a month. Sooner or later, the law of averages, Jimmy the Greek would tell you that the law of averages will dictate that sooner or later someone's going to trip on these shear studs. We saw the fatality data that came from OSHA and their IMUS system, okay? So that's why we have this standard here. So the question is supervisors cannot go ahead and erect beams with shear studs on them for whatever reason. They have to stop. And on this particular job, they did stop. And any of you members and contractors from the greater Boston area, this was a situation, Pat McDermott, Jay Hurley, and Kim knows both of them. They started erecting this building, and they got a hold of the project owner and said, hey, you guys have fabricated this. You can't do this. And the project owner of this particular building agreed with them. So they retrofitted all these beams, and they cut off the shear studs. They ground them down, and they reinstalled them after the metal decking was laid, okay? So in this case, the supervisor did right. They called the employer and said, hey, we can't do this. They called Local 7 Boston with Jay and Pat McDermott and the guys up there, Bernie Evers, and said, we can't do this, cannot do this. So there the supervisor responded appropriately. Kim, do you have anything to say on this particular issue?
No, you've done a very good job. I remember it very well.
Yeah. In fact, Kim was stationed in Boston for a while, and it was Jay Hurley who told me it was a great loss whenever she took a job in Kansas City, and he said it was a big loss to us. We really liked Kim. And then I was in Kim's office the first few days she landed in Kansas City and still had her boxes in your office. Remember that, Kim?
I do indeed. I apologize, Steve, but I'm going to have to step off in a few minutes because I have a prior commitment at noon.
Okay. We'll try to get through this.
Okay.
And you can just sign off whenever you can. But before you go, and if you leave me suddenly, I just want to thank you again, Kim, for all your help and your expertise in this, okay? And us working together to take this at a higher level, okay?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. I will get to you, as I have told several of the questions. I will get to you the NLRB decisions, whether it's the journeyman and the apprenticeship relationship or the other decisions that helped push forward the supervisor, the definition of who's a supervisor or not. I'll bring them to you, Steve, and you can share them with the audience.
Great.
All right.
And Kim, I'd like nothing more than be able to give you a retainer so you could never be used against us in a court of law. Okay. You're very good, and you know your job very well, okay? So you're the last person I would ever want to compete with in a court of law, because you know your job, but you're fair about this. And so that's why I reached out to you. So thank you again, Tim, on behalf of our organization and all you do and taking this to a very higher level. So thanks, Kim.
Thank you all very much, and give me a call if you need help.
Okay. Just hang in there as long as you can.
I shall. I'll stay here.
So same thing goes to our rebar members and contractors. Don't want to exclude you folks, okay? So you can see all the work that went into the fabrication of these big, large rebar columns. And in the one case, it takes 2 cranes to hoist these things into their final position. Now they dress these out with guide cables to stabilize them. In this particular case, they had the guide cables on them, but they didn't put them all on. Okay, it was about lunchtime, and they decided not to install all of them on there, and they collapsed. So this is a situation where, you know, the foreman was asked, well, we had the cables on the columns when we hoisted them. Why didn't you extend them and stick them to the dead men and the anchorage point? Okay, so everything went right until it got down to setting the column at the very last minute, and then the guide cables were not fully installed like they were supposed to be. So Now we're good, Kim, so don't leave us yet. We're down to any other following questions here.
You do have a few questions, Steve.
Yep, we do. We have some questions. Let's start with this one. It goes back, I think, to the screen we had where it showed 3 levels of deck, undecked. Someone's asked, when we have a situation like with 3-story columns, the erectors do not have input on column fabrication. It makes it next to impossible to erect 3 levels of iron when you have tight iron to plumb and deck. Meaning if the decking is right behind the erecting, you're locking the building in and making it very hard for connecting. So maybe the question is, are there ever times that the erector can deviate from some of those things and implement another plan that would suffice for OSHA and still allow some ability to keep erecting of the building?
That's a very good question, and I'm glad that was asked on that particular issue of maintaining a tightly packed deck floor. The answer is this, is we went to the agency after they issued this compliance directive that said you didn't have to put any decking in. We said, look, work with us. Let's define some of these very specific situations where we have 3-story columns or 4-story columns, and we need a short duration exception to let the connectors provide them 100% fall protection, but then they have to come right back down after they do the beams and start doing the decking up. We were all positioned to work with the agency to help identify these certain exceptions to the rule and have a very defined, concise response to these situations. But unfortunately, we didn't get that opportunity, okay? We asked for it, we were supposed to get it, but then another rendition of the compliance directive came out to us 2 months after a meeting, and we never got to sit down and go over these, but we hopefully that we will in the future, because this is an issue that we have to address. We have no control on who designs these columns for a 40-story building, where they're going to have 2-story columns or 3-story columns. If they have 3-story columns, we damn sure have to address this issue, and being able to tie in the column tops and all that, and then bounce back down. But it has to be on a limited basis. So hopefully that answers the question, that we want to get this addressed with the agency. Okay.
Okay. Someone else had asked, and I believe they're referring maybe to where the studs had to be removed from the beams. Did the fabricator absorb the cost of the retrofit? We don't know. All we know is we got authority from the project owner to retrofit them. We're not sure who paid for it, but we were assigned to do all the retrofitting, because we could not continue this multi-tiered building with all these direct violations of subpart R in there. Okay, couldn't do it. Okay. Okay. Another one comes through in the chat. It says, if I'm a supervisor, so I believe this is coming from an iron worker, and it's a good question. If I'm a supervisor and have expressed concern about safety issues with equipment, and it has been reported to the employer, and then he writes, budget is obviously an issue, what would my next steps be to get replacement equipment? So maybe this stems to they're not getting, the employer isn't giving them the equipment they feel they need to operate safely. What are your thoughts there?
Well, this employee has to go to their supervisor first, and then if the supervisor is not doing anything, then unfortunately that's when I get calls, okay, on this very same question. So the employer back at the home office has to be told this, okay? Saying, look, my guys are asking for replacement retractable lanyards. The other ones are full of grit. They're not extending. They're not retracting properly. Some of our lanyards are cut through because of welding burns, whatever. But we need our members to bring us to the attention of the supervisors, right, Kim?
Absolutely.
As a first step.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think this question's coming from someone who's saying, I am the supervisor and I'm not getting what I feel from the contractor, my employer, the equipment. What do I do? What's that person's steps? If they're the supervisor, I'm the foreman on the job, and I think these harnesses are junk. They're wore out. I call the employer. The employer says, hey, deal with it. That's all we got.
Well,
what is that person's next steps?
well, I would say they got to get a hold of their business manager, and if they think that they're working in an unsafe condition or position for equipment wise, they have to run this up the flagpole. Okay, and the business manager will address it in their manner like any other issue. And then if it comes to my attention in the safety department, I assure you, we'll get to the bottom of it. Okay.
Okay. Kim,
And-
your thoughts from OSHA's view of that? If OSHA goes on a site and
It's the same thing. That's the protections. I would tell people document, document, document. If you've raised the concerns to upper management, when, to whom did you discuss them with? What did you discuss? When did you discuss it? How many times did you discuss it? Were there any interim protections taken to remove the employees from risk? And I won't lie to you, we receive a number of complaints from safety managers where that very situation has taken place. Not so much in construction, but in general industry, where upper management pushes it off or delays the option. This is what we got. This is all the money we have. And it is a very difficult situation, but ultimately it is in protection of the employees, removing them from risk. And you need to take whatever efforts you see fit to remove those employees from risk.
okay.
Good answer.
Yeah, really good answer.
Anything else, Pete?
Well, there's a couple people that have asked, will this be available to share with other people, employees at a later date?
Yes.
I would answer both of those yes. If they go to the Impact website, they will see a link that shows where you can view these again on YouTube. So I see Kim has dropped off. I wish I could have thanked her also, and I will follow up that that's been great having her on, to have someone, a regional director of OSHA on to answer questions and disseminate information has been really invaluable. It's been a great call. I don't see any other questions. I hope I haven't missed any, and certainly if someone has one, we still have time. You can jump in and ask them. So Steve, I don't see anything yet. Do you have anything you'd like to kind of close out with, or any thoughts?
I would. I just wanted to thank the staff that helped us do this behind the scenes using this new ringtone software. And I know Sarah Shafatel is on the line, and I wanted to thank her. She's a director of public relations and communications. She does a good job in supporting all of us, Pete, and making sure that we can communicate effectively on a national basis. And also Tim and IT department that worked with all of us to make sure we didn't have any hiccups with today's session. So thanks for them, for their support, and thank you to Kim for her participation today and her expertise in this matter, which you saw firsthand. And thanks, Pete, for promoting this. And as always, thank the two co-chairs of Impact, President Dean and Mr. Bill Brown, for all their support for the safety department and this very serious topic of supervisors in the workplace and their resources to help us develop this Ironworker Safety Certification program that's coming out next year. So thanks for all this effort. And Pete, Kim, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Steve, for that. Again, it's been great. I want to urge everybody again, if you missed this or if you want to use this information, there will be a link on the website within a day or two so that you can view it again on YouTube, go through it, use it. That's what it's there for. Safety is obviously the #1 concern for all of us, and we want to get this information out and get it shared. And I'll remind everybody, our next safety call is on December 18th. I know that's 7 days before Christmas. Hopefully everybody can still find the time to jump in and join us. Our guest speaker is going to be Billy Smith. He's an absolute expert in cranes, crane safety, assembly, disassembly, all those things we're going to talk about. And as we see in the news, when a crane goes down, it's high profile. Sadly, there have been lives lost, not just of iron workers, but of the general public, and those things are absolutely unacceptable. And so we are going to dive into cranes, and that pertains to all of us, whether you're hanging structural steel or rebar or whatever it is. I think every iron worker out there is involved with the crane day in and day out in most sites. Yeah. So it's going to be a great call. We're looking forward to it. And again, I'd urge everybody to put that on their calendar now, December 18th.
Yeah. Pete, On that note, I wanted to mention that Bill Smith is one of our instructors for the Ironworker Safety Director training course. And for 4 hours, he downloads of everyone in the audience, over 500 of them, what their roles and responsibilities are as the assembly disassembly director. Whether you own a crane, you rent a crane, or the general contractor comes to you, Pete, and say, hey, I want your guys to assemble and disassemble my crane. Your supervisor, working in tandem with the crane manufacturer's tech thing, they better know their roles and responsibilities, okay? Not only the OSHA new crane standard, but also the ANSI B30.5 standards that also addresses what they call the lift director. Close to the same as the assembly disassembly director, but they have some additional responsibilities. So I'm sure all of you are going to find Bill Smith. He is one of the foremost authorities on cranes. He was a crane operator. He worked on the CDAC committee on writing the new crane standards. Okay, he's very well versed, and I think he's going to be a great topic for your next national safety call. So,
All right. Well, we're looking forward to December 18, and hope everyone can join us for that. If you didn't get a chance to view it all or want to use this talk again, it's going to be available on the website at impact-net.org. Thank you, Steve. Thank you to everyone who participated, and be safe out there.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.